She went to the palace to meet the king, a king she had never met, about a wedding she had already planned, with a man she had already chosen. She walked into that throne room with her future intact. She walked out belonging to someone else, not because of anything she did, not because of anything she said, because of something in her blood that she did not know was there, something the king had spent 6 months researching, something her grandfather buried 3 generations ago and told no one about, something that has been sleeping quietly inside her for 22 years and is about to wake up. Subscribe, because you need to hear what happens next. The kingdom of Valdris had not seen snowfall so thickly in 100 years. It came down in curtains, burying the cobblestones of the outer villages, swallowing the forest roads, silencing the world beneath a white so absolute it felt like a burial shroud draped over the living. The wolves in the mountains howled through it, their cries longer and more mournful than the elders could remember, and the old women who still read bones by firelight whispered that the snow was not a blessing this season. It was a warning. Alara Ashvale stood at the frost-glazed window of the cottage she shared with her mother and watched the flakes descend. She was 22, with dark auburn hair the color of dried blood and eyes that shifted between gray and green depending on the light. As she was beautiful in the way that made strangers pause mid-sentence, not because she tried to be, but because something about her seemed slightly too vivid for ordinary life, as though she had been placed in the wrong story. Beside her stood Caden Morrow, the man she intended to marry. Caden was tall and broad-shouldered, a tanner's son who had built himself into a man of modest means through honest labor. He had warm brown eyes, a jaw dusted with 3 days of winter stubble, and a laugh that made rooms feel smaller and safer. He loved Alara with the uncomplicated fierceness of a man who had decided and would not be revisited on the subject. "We should go soon," he said, placing his hands on her shoulders. "The roads will close by nightfall." Alara nodded but did not turn from the window. The wolves were howling again. Closer now. "Itis Caden," she said quietly. "Do we have to go to the palace?" "Protocol requires it." He kissed the top of her head. "The king must be informed of all intended unions within his territory. You know the law." She did know the law. Everyone in Valdris knew the law. King Aldrich the Immovable had written it himself 20 years ago, carved it into the stone above the palace gates. All matters of blood and bond belong first to the throne. It was the kind of law that sounded ceremonial until you tried to ignore it, and then it revealed itself to be a cage. They set out before dawn, wrapped in wool and fur, their breath fogging ahead of them as their boots broke through the snow's thin crust with each step. The road to Valdris Palace cut through the Ashwood Forest, and the trees there were ancient and enormous. In their bare branches interlocked overhead like the fingers of sleeping giants. Shadows moved between the trunks. Alara kept her eyes forward. She wanted to tell Caden about the dreams she had been having, the same one every night for 2 weeks. A silver wolf standing in falling snow, watching her with golden eyes that held something uncomfortably close to recognition. She wanted to tell him that she had begun, in weak moments, to wonder if the wolf in her dream was not a symbol but a memory. But she said nothing. She took his hand instead, and they walked. The palace of Valdris rose from the snowfield like a blade. It was all black stone and iron towers, built by a king 3 centuries ago who had reportedly wanted his home to look like a threat. He had succeeded. The gates were open. They were always open. Because King Aldrich maintained that a king who locks his gates admits he has something to fear. And the guards waved them through with barely a glance. Inside, warmth pressed against them like a living thing. Tapestries lined the corridor walls, depicting ancient battles and scenes from the old war that had ended the age of open shifting, when the werewolf clans had signed the Accord of Ash and vowed to live as men. The tapestries were old and faded, but Alara found herself slowing as she walked past them. drawn to a recurring figure woven through every scene, a silver wolf rampant on a field of white. She had seen those eyes before, every night for 2 weeks. They were brought into the throne room after a wait of 40 minutes, and Alara sat very still with her hands folded in her lap, while listening to the silence of a palace that contained something large and held its breath around it. Then the doors opened and they walked into the presence of King Aldrich. He was older than his portraits. The portraits showed a man in his vigorous 50s, iron-haired, commanding, a soldier's posture, and a conqueror's eyes. The man on the throne was all of that, and something more the portraits had not captured. A density, a sense of compressed force, as though he contained an entire weather system and was choosing for the moment not to release it. Beside the throne, half in shadow, stood the prince. Alara had not expected the prince to be present. She had not expected him to be this. Tall, dark-haired, with his father's jaw and something in his eyes that reminded her of the wolves outside. A gold-lit quality, warm and ancient and entirely awake. His name was Dorian. Caden stated their names and their purpose. The king listened. He looked at Caden briefly, politely, the way a man looks at furniture adequately positioned. Then he looked at Alara, and he looked for a very long time. The silence began to thicken into something she recognized, though she could not name it yet. Danger. Your family name, the king said at last. Ashvale. Yes, your majesty. Your mother's name before marriage. Rena Voss, your majesty. Something moved across the king's face. Not emotion. He did not appear to traffic in emotion, but calculation. The movement of pieces on a board. He sat forward in his throne, steepled his fingers, and studied her with the patience of a man who had never once been told he could not have what he wanted. Yeah, I'm afraid, King Aldrich said, in the pleasantly reasonable tone of a man announcing a change in weather, that I cannot permit this union. Caden's breath caught. Your Majesty, be still. The king's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. You are to be betrothed to my son, Prince Dorian. The arrangement will be formalized before the next full moon. The silence that followed was enormous. Alara looked at the king. Then she looked at the prince. Dorian had not moved, but something in his expression had changed. The careful blankness was still there, but behind it something had surfaced. The door was still shut, but she could hear now what was pressing against it from the other side. It was not joy. It was not indifference either. It was recognition. He had seen her before. She was almost certain of it. So yeah. With a certainty that had no logic and carried all the weight of truth. He had seen her before, and the silver wolf in her dreams had his eyes, and the snow outside was falling harder now, and somewhere in the mountains the wolves were howling as though the world was about to end. Or be reborn. You cannot simply... Caden started. I can, said the king, and I have. CTA number 1. Deliver with quiet intensity. A king just decided her entire future in 30 seconds. Caden is gone. The palace doors are closing, and the man she has been seeing in her dreams for 2 weeks is standing 10 feet away, looking at her like he already knows how this story ends. But here's the question that should be keeping you awake right now. Why does the most powerful king in the territory need this specific woman for his son? What does he know about her blood that she doesn't know about herself yet? Stay with me, because what happens in the next room changes everything. They did not let Caden stay. This was done politely, efficiently, and with a finality that left no crack for argument. A royal steward materialized at his elbow, offered him warm bread and coin for his journey home, and steered him toward the door with the practiced grace of a man who had been removing unwanted people from rooms for 30 years. At the door, Caden turned back. His eyes found Alara's across the length of the throne room. She gave him the smallest nod she could manage. I'm all right. She was not entirely certain that was true. Then he was gone, and the doors closed, and she was alone in the palace of the king who had just claimed her. King Aldrich moved to the window, his hands clasped behind his back, looking out over the snow-buried courtyard below. Without the elevation of the throne, he was simply an old man in heavy clothing. Except that he wasn't, not even slightly, because the compressed force had followed him down from the dais and stood around him like a second skin. "Your mother is Rena Voss," he said. "Her father was Emmerich Voss." Something in his tone made her careful. "I knew him as Grandfather Emmerich. He died when I was 4. Did your mother ever tell you what her father was?" The question sat between them like a stone dropped in still water. Alara felt the ripples move through her, on touching things she had kept in quiet places for years. The dreams. The way she could hear things others couldn't. The incident 3 winters ago when she had run so fast through the forest that she had frightened herself. When she had stopped and found her hands trembling and the world flooding her with the smell of everything at once. "She told me he was a farmer," Alara said. "He was." Aldrich nodded. "He was also a wolf." The fire crackled. In the shadow by the throne, Prince Dorian finally moved. Not much, barely a shift of weight, but Alara noticed. She was beginning to notice everything. The Voss bloodline, the king continued, was one of the 12 original clans who signed the Accord of Ash. They agreed to bind their shifting, to live as men, to give up the old ways in exchange for peace with the human kingdoms. He paused. Most held to that. Emmerich Voss was a man of his word. But blood does not negotiate, girl. Blood does what blood does. "Are you telling me," Alara said slowly, "that I am a werewolf?" "I'm telling you that you carry the blood. Whether it has woken in you is a different question." His dark eyes moved across her face. "Has it?" She thought of the dreams, the impossible speed, the night she had stood in the forest and heard the wolves' conversation in the hills as clearly as speech. "I don't know," she said. The king nodded as though she had confirmed something. "My son is also a wolf. The royal bloodline of Valdris has carried wolf blood for 200 years. Dorian inherited the full shift. His mother did not survive the experience of bearing a pup of that magnitude." He looked at her steadily. "The full moon comes in 11 days. On that night, Dorian shifts whether he wills it or not. A wolf the size of my son, unchecked, is a danger to everything within a mile." He paused. "Except for his mate." The word dropped into the room and changed the air. "A bonded mate acts as an anchor." Aldrich continued, as though they were discussing crop yields and not the complete redirection of her life. "It stabilizes the wolf, gives the wolf a center, something to return to." He looked at his son. "My son has known your face for 3 years. He saw you in a dream. A silver wolf," he said, "standing in the snow." The breath left her body. She turned to look at Dorian directly, fully, for the first time. He had stepped from the shadow and she could see him clearly now. The careful blankness of his face. The gold light in his dark eyes that was not a trick of the flame. And the set of his jaw bearing an entirely different interior than his father's. He looked at her the way the wolf in her dreams had looked at her. With that unbearable, specific, absolute recognition. "I am sorry," he said. His voice was low and controlled, a voice that had learned restraint from long practice. "For the manner of this, I argued against it. And yet, here we are," she said. "And yet, here we are." She turned back to the king. The fury in her was clean and hot, and she let herself feel it. "You have stolen my choice," she said. "I have preserved my son's life," Aldrich replied without apology. "You may hate me, Many do. But you will be here when the moon rises, and you will look at my son, and the bond will do what bonds do. This is not a request." She stood, her chair scraped back. The guards tensed, but she wasn't running. There was nowhere to run. The snow had seen to that. The palace had seen to that. And something deeper, older, something that lived in her blood had apparently been seeing to that for years. "I want Caden Morrow protected," she said. "Whatever comes, he is not to be punished." Done. "I want to write to my mother." Done. "And I want the truth, all of it, not pieces handed out when convenient. If I am to be used, I will at least know the shape of what I am being used for." The king studied her for a long moment. Then something flickered in his expression, something that in a lesser man might have been respect. "You are very much your grandfather's blood," he said. And somehow that was not a comfort. And also, obscurely, was. He turned to his son. "Show her to the east wing. And Dorian." A pause waited with the full gravity of a father speaking to the thing he loves most. "Do not lie to her. She will know." Dorian crossed the room toward her. Up close, he was taller than she had registered, and the pine and wild scent of him reached her, layered and mineral and ancient, and her blood catalogued it with an attention that alarmed her. "This way," he said. She followed, because there was nothing else to do. Her rooms were in a rounded tower in the oldest part of the palace. Warmer than expected, a fire already burning, furs on the bed, a window facing the mountains. She stood in the center of the room while a steward set things out and then left, and it was just her and the prince, who stood in the doorway with his hand on the frame as though he hadn't decided whether to enter or depart. "What, you can come in," she said, "if you have more to say." He came in. He moved to the window, looking out at the falling snow, and she noticed he did this the same way his father did, that instinct to put glass between themselves and the world. "Tell me about the bond," she said. "The real version, not your father's." He sat in the chair near the fire, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. The posture, she was learning, of Dorian being as honest as he knew how to be. "The bond is a recognition," he said. "When a wolf finds their matched blood, someone the deeper self identifies as home, the bond responds. It doesn't create feelings. It simply removes the static, the constant low noise that a wolf lives with every day. A careful breath. Everything becomes quieter." "And without the bond?" she asked. You said the full moons have been managed." His jaw moved. "Chains," he said flatly. "An iron room in the lower palace, reinforced over 30 years. They hold for most of the night." His eyes met hers briefly. "Most. Have you heard anyone?" "Not permanently." He looked at the fire. "There have been close calls. The most recent was 2 months ago. A guard entered the room too early. He will walk again, the physicians say, eventually." A pause with iron in it. "That cannot happen again." She crossed the room and stood in front of him. "I have not agreed to this," she said quietly. "Whatever your father decided, whatever the blood knows, I have not agreed, and I will not agree under coercion." She held his gaze. "But I am not running. I'm still here. And I would like to spend the next 11 days getting to know the person I may or may not end up bonded to. Honestly, without politics." Dorian was still for a long moment. Then he exhaled, slow and complete, releasing something he had been holding since the throne room. "I think I would like that too," he said. "Good." She stepped back. "Then start by telling me everything your father didn't. About the wolf lines, about my grandfather, about whatever made him look at me in that throne room like he had been waiting." "That," he said, "will take more than 1 night. Good thing the snow has closed all the roads." For the first time, briefly, fractionally, as though it surprised even him, he smiled. It changed his face so completely that she understood it was the real one, The face under the face. Named the one that hadn't learned to disappear yet. She filed it away. She was building a picture of him, one detail at a time. She was beginning to think the picture was going to be complicated. She was beginning to think she did not mind. She did not sleep that first night. She lay listening to the palace breathe, cataloging its sounds, the distant shift of a guard's boots, the structural settling of old walls against cold, wind finding gaps in the window frames. The fire died to embers. She watched the ceiling. Caden would be home by now. She felt the loss of him like a bruise, not a wound, not the sharp severing pain she might have expected, but a deep ache in the place where certainty lives. She had loved Caden with the comfortable, grateful love of someone who had found a good thing and known enough to hold it. She had not loved him with her blood. She was beginning to understand the difference, and she wasn't sure yet whether that understanding was a gift or a theft. She fell asleep sometime before dawn and dropped immediately into the dream. It was different from all the others. The silver wolf was not watching from a distance this time. It was beside her. She could feel the warmth of it pressing against her, and she understood in the way of dreams that she was not a person standing beside a wolf. She was also a wolf. She was running, not running from. Running as speed itself, as the clean animal joy of a body doing exactly what it was made to do. Beside her, the dark wolf matched her stride for stride. The snow blurred beneath her. Wine the cold was not cold, but simply air. The world rushing through her. And there was nothing else. No palace, no king, no stolen future. Only the running, only the snow, only the feeling of two things meant to move together. Moving together at last. She woke with her heart slamming and her blood singing. She sat up in the gray light, breathing hard. She looked at her hands. Her hands were her hands, but they were trembling. She dressed and went to find Dorian. She found the library by instinct, following a thread she didn't have a name for yet. The faint pull of something compatible and close. He was at a table near the window with a book open before him and cold tea at his elbow, and he looked up when she entered with the expression of a man who had been waiting but had the grace not to say so. "You dreamed," he said. "So we were both wolves. We were running." He closed the book carefully. That happens. The blood connection deepens in proximity to compatible wolf ancestry. The dreaming is the subconscious practicing. He paused. It will intensify as the moon gets closer. He stood and went to the shelf, returning with a thick old ledger, worn smooth by decades of handling. "The Accord Registry," he said. "Every wolf line that signed. Their lineage, their territory, their binding status." She opened it, turned pages until she found it. Voss, Emmerich, Hyphen territory, silver blood line, Accord signatory, full binding voluntary, status deceased. Silver blood, she said. The oldest lineage. The first wolves according to the oldest stories. The ones who carried the purest shift. The ones who could go silver. Most wolf lines produce dark pelts. Browns. Eye blacks, deep grays. He met her eyes. Silver is rare. In the last 200 years, there have been perhaps 30 recorded silvers. My great-great-grandmother was one. "My shift," she said slowly. "If it comes, will it be silver?" He looked at her steadily. "I believe so. The blood is strong enough." "And that's what your father actually wants. Not just a bond, a silver bond. Another silver in the bloodline. What my father wants and what the situation genuinely requires are not always separable," Dorian said. "Yes, a silver bond is more stabilizing. Yes, the bloodline politics are stronger. Yes, he has reasons beyond the humanitarian for wanting this." He met her eyes. "None of that makes the bond itself wrong. I need you to be able to separate those things because I am trying to every hour And it would help to not be doing it alone. It is easier for you to separate them, she said. You receive something you want. I was taken. Yes, he said simply and without deflection. You are right. I cannot make that not true. He stopped. When I dream of the silver wolf, I have never dreamed of someone who did not want to be there. The words landed in the silence and stayed. That is not a justification, she said. No, it is not. He looked at her with the expression of a person translating himself back into genuine feeling after too long speaking only management. I have been waiting 3 years to speak to you, and now you are here, and the situation is terrible. And I do not know what to do with either of those facts except be honest about both. CTA number 2. Deliver with rising urgency. She is carrying the blood of the rarest wolf line in history. He has been dreaming of her for 3 years. And somewhere in this palace, a man she has never heard of is already writing letters that could destroy everything. The Bond, the Prince, and every wolf bloodline in the territory. The question is, does Ilara find out in time? And when she does, is she already too late? Do not go anywhere. On the 4th day, Caden came back. Ilara heard about it from a kitchen maid, who heard it from a guard, who heard it from the gatehouse. A man had arrived half frozen, having walked through a day and 2 nights of snowfall. Ethan was making considerable noise in the outer courtyard, demanding to speak with whoever was responsible for the unjust imprisonment of Ilara Ashvale of Fenwick Village. She was out of her rooms before the maid finished the sentence. He looked terrible. 2 days of hard winter had done to his face what his good nature usually prevented it from showing. The pure, concentrated stubbornness of a man who had decided something and would not be undecided by weather or kings. His coat was crusted with ice. His jaw was set like a door barred from inside. Ilara. He crossed the space in 3 steps and took her hands, turning them over to check them. Old habit. Are you hurt? I'm not hurt. They're keeping you here against your will. It's complicated. It isn't, he said flatly. Yeah, it's a man with more power than conscience taking what he wants. That is not complicated. That is just old. She felt the familiar warmth of him, that uncomplicated, load-bearing quality that had always made the ground feel more solid within his radius. And she felt, simultaneously, with the senses sharpening every day in the palace, how entirely human he was. His blood was singular and warm and completely itself, moving through him in a single clean note with no undertones, no strata, no old frequencies running beneath the audible range. She had been living inside the layered complexity of Dorian's presence for 4 days. And standing now in front of Caden, she felt the difference, the way you feel the difference between a room with a fire and a room where a fire recently burned. Both were real. Both had given her warmth. While they were not the same warmth, she sat him down and told him everything. The accord, the bloodlines, the dreams, the full moon and what it did to Dorian and what the bond was, and why she was still here voluntarily even if her arrival had not been. She told him all of it plainly, and watched his face move through its sequence. Disbelief, then alarm, then the specific stillness of a person confronting a truth that changes the entire landscape. You're telling me, he said at last, that you are a werewolf. I'm telling you I carry the blood. Whether, Ilara. He looked at her with those clear brown eyes that had always seen her without adjustment. Are you telling me that some part of you already knows you are going to shift? She opened her mouth. The denial came on instinct. She felt it form. Why felt it ready, and then felt the other thing, the silver thing, pressing against its own boundary with increasing confidence, and the denial dissolved. Yes, she said. He exhaled. long and slow, taking something with it. Not hope exactly, but a version of the future he had been living inside, a particular shape of what came next that had been warm and real and his and was now not. He did not look away from her. She loved him most for this. "Is it him?" Caden said. "The prince." She could have made it clinical. She could have wrapped the truth in so much scaffolding it became architecture rather than admission. But he had walked 2 days through snowstorms for her. That love had earned its answer. "It's not what I chose," she said. "But yes, there is something there." His face did not crumble. Instead, something more complex moved through it. The recognition of a truth that had been approaching for some time and had finally arrived close enough to see clearly. "You were always a bit too alive for the village," he said quietly. "I told myself many things." He stopped. "Do you want me to fight for you?" "Because I will. I understand what fighting means here, and I will still do it if you want me to." She thought of him in the iron room. She thought of what Dorian had told her about the guard who would walk again, eventually. "No," she said. "I want you to go home and be safe." He nodded with the dignity of a person who does not require the world to be fair in order to behave well within it. He reached out and touched her face, one hand briefly the cup of his palm against her cheek. Knew a touch that contained a long acquaintance and a specific tenderness and the quiet closing of something that had been open and warm and real. Then he let his hand fall. "Send word," he said, "when you know who you are." "I will," she said. He left. The snow closed over his footprints in under an hour, as though the world was already rewriting itself around the shape of what was coming. When she returned to the library, Dorian looked up, and whatever he read in her face, he did not comment on directly. "I'm sorry," he said. "Are you?" "Yes. A man who walks 2 days through closing winter for someone is a person worth grieving. I did not want to be the cause of that grief, even at one remove." She believed him. That was the thing she kept returning to. She kept believing him. Not because she was overcome by blood pull or golden eyes. But because Dorian had not once, in 4 days, said anything she had subsequently discovered to be untrue. In this palace, in this situation, that was not a small thing. That was possibly the most valuable thing. "Tell me something I don't know yet," she said. He looked at the map before him, then at her. The way he looked when he was deciding how much truth the moment could hold. "There is an advisor in this palace," he said. "His name is Gregor Fenn. He has been here 15 years. My father trusts him completely." He paused. "My father is wrong too." She waited. "I have suspected Fenn for 3 years," Dorian said quietly. "I have never been able to prove it, and I have never been able to make my father hear it." His eyes met hers. "6 days from now, when I am locked in iron and the shift has me, Fenn will be in this palace. And he will have a plan." "What kind of plan?" Dorian looked at the fire. "The kind," he said, "that doesn't leave loose ends." On the 5th day, Ilara found out. She had taken to walking the East Corridor in the early afternoons, learning the palace the way she was learning everything else, by instinct, following threads, letting her sharpening senses gather what the eyes alone would miss. She had begun to understand that a building is never simply a building. It is a record. Every room that has held fear still smells faintly of it. Every corridor that has carried conspiracy has a particular deadness to its sound. The East Corridor, near the portrait gallery, had that quality in one specific stretch. She was walking it slowly when she heard the voice. It came from behind a door ajar by 3 inches. Pitched with the careful precision that carries without appearing aimed. The voice of a man who had mastered the art of being overheard only by the people he intended to overhear him. "The girl concerns me. Silver blood loose in the palace 6 days before a full moon, with no formal binding, no containment protocol. The king has decided. A second voice said, younger, less certain. The king decides many things. A warm, sympathetic pause. The king is also a father, and fathers make decisions in the interest of their children that they would not make as kings. The reasonable voice settling into its point like a blade finding its groove. I am not questioning his love for Dorian. I am asking whether love is the correct advisor when the subject is security. Alara stopped walking. She stood very still in the corridor, and her blood-sharpened senses reached forward through the gap in the door. 2 heartbeats, distinct and readable. The second voice, elevated, the biochemistry of a person being carefully moved from one position to another. The first voice, Fenn's, completely, almost inhumanly steady. The pulse of a man who is always doing exactly what he planned to do. If the bond forms, the second voice began. If the bond forms, Fenn said with the gentle patience of someone explaining something to a person he has decided is capable of understanding it, we have a silver wolf bonded to the crown for the next half-century. The Accord territories have been patient about the Dorian situation because it has been contained, because the Iron Room has held, because the optics have been managed carefully. A pause. Orc, a bonded Silver Queen changes every optic simultaneously. She would stabilize him. She would stabilize him. She would also strengthen him in ways that cannot be unstabilized afterward. The reasonable voice sharpened at its edge. Briefly, like a knife turned to show its cutting side and then turned away. The Accord exists because the wolf lines agreed to become less dangerous over time. Every decision that reverses that trajectory is a decision against everything the Accord was built to protect. Ilara pressed herself against the corridor wall and listened. I am not suggesting anything precipitous, Fenn continued, in the tone of a man who had been not suggesting precipitous things for 15 years. I am suggesting that responsible governance requires contingency planning. What kind of contingencies? A pause, and the length of it precisely calibrated. I have been in contact, Fenn said quietly, with parties in the outer territories who possess knowledge we lack. Specific knowledge about silverblood bonding, about methods of severance that predate the Accord and were deliberately excluded from the official registry. Another pause. It is possible to sever a formed bond. The process is not pleasant for either party, but it is possible. It is clean, and it is permanent. Alara felt the cold arrive in her spine like something poured. The king would never sanction. The king would not need to know until the situation had already been resolved, Fenn said. And beneath the reasonable voice, finally, something else, not malice exactly, but the quality of a person who has been moving toward a destination for a very long time and can see it now and does not intend to be stopped. By which point the problem would be settled. I have served Aldrich faithfully for 15 years. I am serving him now. He will understand this, eventually, as an act of loyalty. She was already moving. She found Dorian in the Iron Room, sitting against the far wall, back straight, taking his own temperature the way he did in the days before the moon. He was on his feet before she reached the door. What happened? He said. She told him everything. Every word, every pause, the precise, unhurried quality of Fenn's heartbeat during the conversation. She watched Dorian's face move through recognition, then the quiet, directed fury of the wolf kind, and then something that surprised her. Relief. You have suspected, she said, for 3 years. He was already moving, lifting the torch from its bracket. Come, there are things I need to show you. He took her through a passage behind a tapestry depicting the Accord signing. 12 wolf representatives and 12 human representatives across a table. The expressions of people who had been at war long enough that peace felt almost as dangerous as fighting. Behind it was a door. Behind the door was a small room packed with documents older and less organized than the library's holdings. He found a bundle of letters in a wooden box, set them on the table. "These came to my father 8 years ago," he said, "from a coalition in the outer territories, a formal argument that the accord had been insufficiently enforced." He spread them carefully. My father dismissed them, that he attributed them to general anti-wolf sentiment, moved on. But Fen was already here by then. Fen arrived 13 years ago, before these letters. He looked at her, meaning his presence in this palace preceded the official communication. He was not appointed by my father in response to anti-wolf pressure. He paused. He was placed here. The pressure came after. By the coalition. By whoever is behind the coalition. Someone with resources and old grievances and 15 years of patience. He sat down. "I have been building this case for 3 years and could not give it to my father because Fen has spent 15 years making my father's trust in him structural. Removing it requires not just what you heard in the corridor. It requires the letters. It requires the timeline. And it requires..." He stopped. What? A witness he trusts more than me? He said it without self-pity. "I am not the right messenger. I have argued against Fen before and been overruled. But you..." He met her eyes. "You arrived 5 days ago. You have no history here. No established position. No reason to fabricate a conspiracy against a man you had never heard of before yesterday." She understood. "I am the witness. If you are willing." She looked at the letters spread between them. 15 years of careful infiltration. Documented, time-stamped, damning. 6 days, she said. 6 days, he agreed. And Fen's courier left the palace last night. Whoever is waiting in the outer territories now knows the moon is coming. He met her eyes. "We go to my father tomorrow. And if he doesn't believe us?" Dorian was quiet for a long moment. In the torchlight, his eyes held that gold quality, the wolf present, alert, oriented toward her with that complete and steady attention that she had stopped finding alarming and had started finding simply true. "Then on the night of the moon," he said, "we face it alone." They went to the king that evening. Dorian knocked on the door of his father's private study, the one place in the palace where Aldrich kept no advisors after the evening meal, where he went to read and to think and to be, for 2 hours a night, something approaching a private person. The king looked up from his book when they entered, and his eyes moved from his son to the woman beside him with rapid, visible recalibration. "Sit down," he said, before either of them spoke. They sat. Ilara told him everything. She told it in order, precisely, and without embellishment. The corridor, the door ajar by 3 inches, Fen's exact words, the steady heartbeat, the courier, the letters from the wooden box. The timeline that established Fen had arrived before the coalition's formal approach, making him not an appointee but a plant. The king listened without interrupting once. When she finished, the study was silent for a long time. "The letters," he said at last. "You have them." Dorian placed them on the desk. Aldrich looked at them without touching them. Then he looked at his son. Then he looked at Ilara with those dark, precise eyes, and she felt the truth sense moving across her, the wolf blood reading her physiology with the instinctive accuracy of something that had been doing this for centuries. "You are telling me the truth," he said. "Yes, Your Majesty." Another silence. Longer. Leave me," he said. "Father, leave me." The compressed force fully present in the words now, not directed at them, simply present the way weather is present. "I will send for you in the morning." In the corridor outside, Ilara and Dorian stood in the torchlight and said nothing for a long moment, because nothing would improve on the silence. "Do you think he'll act?" she said finally. Dorian looked at the closed door. My father has not been genuinely surprised in 15 years. What happens when something reaches the place where the real decisions live? He paused. I have never seen it. I don't know. 5 days, she said. 5 days. The king did not sleep that night. Ilara knew this the way she knew most things now, not by seeing but by sensing, the palace's nighttime geography mapped in her blood. While she lay in the tower room and felt him in the west wing, awake and working, grinding through something that required the full machinery of an exceptional mind. Somewhere in that machinery, 15 years of trust was being dismantled piece by piece, and the man doing the dismantling had built his entire identity on knowing, on always, in every meaningful way, being ahead. He had not been ahead. He had been a room in someone else's house. The king sent for them at first light. He looked like a man who had done heavy labor through the night. Not disordered. Aldrich was not a man who permitted dishevelment, but there was something in his eyes that had not been there the evening before. A stripped-back plainness. The long, dark hours had removed a layer of governance and performance and left something closer to the man underneath. I have read the letters 4 times, he said, still at the window, addressing the snow and the mountains. I have reconstructed the timeline 6 times. The conclusion does not change. A pause. Fen arrived in this palace 13 months before the Coalition's first letter. I appointed him on the recommendation of Lord Castor of the Eastern Outer Territories, who I now understand was himself a member of the Coalition at the time of the recommendation. He turned. His face was the face of a king. It was also, underneath that, the face of a father who had spent the night understanding how completely and for how long he had been the instrument of a threat against the thing he loved most. I owe you an accounting, he said. He was looking at Dorian only. You told me 3 years ago that something was wrong, specifically. I overruled you. I told you that your concerns were the natural anxiety of a wolf suspicious of human power, and that this was understandable but not a basis for accusation. He stopped. I was wrong in a way that nearly cost you your life. You will not be disbelieved again. The room was very still. Dorian looked at his father, looked at the complicated freight of years of a specific kind of aloneness, the years of bringing truth to the throne and being sent away with it. He decided, as she had watched him decide things before, that honesty was the only currency worth spending. What are you going to do about Fen? He said. Fen will be taken into custody this morning, quietly, before he knows the decision has been made. The king looked at Ilara. You are certain he does not know you heard him? Certain. Your Majesty. Then we have the advantage. He looked back at the letters. His contacts in the outer territories are a larger matter. Neutralizing Fen does not neutralize the organization. That is a longer problem. He looked at his son. Longer than 4 days. Yes, Dorian said. Then the immediate priority is the moon. The king looked at Ilara, and his look was different from any he had given her. Less calculating, more direct. The look of a man trying, imperfectly and late, to see a person he had previously only seen as a variable. You were brought here against your will. I arranged circumstances rather than asking. He paused. I will not insult you with coin or title as substitute for the choice I removed. I will only ask, and I am asking, the not telling, whether you are willing to stand with my son when the moon rises. The silence was total. She looked at the king, the man who had taken her life and redirected it with the confidence of someone who had never needed to ask. She found that she did not hate him, which surprised her. She found that she understood him, which surprised her more. He was a father who had made the mistake that fathers with too much power always make. He had decided that loving his child and controlling everything around that child were the same decision, and he had been making it for 30 years, and its full cost had just been delivered to him in a night. She turned to Dorian. He was watching her with the gold-lit eyes and the settled warmth of the bond running between them. Not electric anymore. Not the desperate recognition of the early days. It's something deeper. The kind of knowing that has passed through its first fire and come out tempered. Yes, she said. The king closed his eyes. 2 seconds. Then they opened, and he was entirely the king again. The machinery re-engaged, the decisions already forming. Then we have work to do, he said. Fen was taken before the second breakfast bell. 4 guards, chosen for their 30 years of unimpeachable service, came to his private rooms efficiently and without violence. Fen received it with the composure of a man who had always known this was a possible outcome. He asked to speak to the king directly. The king declined. A courier was dispatched to intercept the letter that had left the servant's gate. 2 days later, that courier returned with the letter unopened and the messenger cooperative under the right conditions of persuasion. The machinery of Gregor Fenn's 15-year construction was being dismantled piece by piece with the same meticulous patience that had built it. But in the outer territories, the machine had other parts, and some of them were already moving. The night before the full moon, Old Blood arrived at Valdris Palace. Edric Harkon came first, 73 years old, broad as a barn door, white-haired with a face weathered past the distinction between expression and landscape. He had 2 wolves with him in human form, young men who moved through the palace with the automatic professional attention of creatures in unfamiliar territory. While he came to the doors and looked up at the palace for a long moment, taking its measure, reacquainting himself with something he had last seen from a different angle, and then he walked in. He looked at the king first, the look of a man checking whether the person across from him is the same species of serious the situation requires. Then he looked at Alara. His expression changed. "Silver," he said, not a greeting, a sighting. "My grandfather was Emmerich Voss," she said. Something moved through Edric's face, deep and old, the movement of something that had been very still for a very long time. "I stood beside Emmerich Voss at the accord signing. I was 19 years old. He was the only other Silver in the room." He looked at her with these permanent weather eyes. "He told me the day he took the binding that it would not hold forever. He said blood is longer than a man's decision." He paused. He was right. Marin Vane and her son Tal arrived as the hall was being lit for evening. Marin with the posture of a woman who had spent decades carrying something no one around her could see, and beside her a young man of 25 named Tal who had the uneven brightness of someone still learning the boundaries of what he was. He looked at Dorian the moment he entered, and the look contained recognition, a little awe, and the first stirring of an awareness that he was not the only one. Dorian met the look and gave him a nod that contained more than nods usually contain. The last arrival came in the small hours of the morning while the great hall lay quiet. A man of perhaps 60, lean, carrying nothing extra, with eyes that were entirely gold. Constant gold, warm and total. Were the eyes of someone in whom the wolf was not secondary but simply the primary and most honest face. He stood in the torchlit corridor with snow still melting from his coat and looked at Alara. "You sent the frequency," he said, 3 weeks ago, before you knew what it was. In your sleep." She stared. "I wasn't trying to send anything 3 weeks ago." "The blood sends before the mind teaches it not to," he said simply. "I have been traveling since I received it." He looked past her into the hall, the maps, the registry, the king, the gathered bloodlines. "I am the last Voss," he said. "Emmerich was my uncle. I have been alone with this blood for 40 years. He met her eyes. "I came because you called, and because it is time." Behind her, Edric Harkon's voice. "Come in from the cold. I brother." And in Alara's blood, the silver frequency, which had been building for days, which had been building for 22 years, which had perhaps been building since her grandfather stood at a table and trusted the blood to find its way, rose to a pitch that was no longer background noise. It was a chord. Complete. Ready. The moon rose at 7 minutes past the 6th hour. Alara felt it before she saw it. Not the gentle tide pull of the previous days. This was different in the way that weather approaching and weather arriving are different. Not a matter of degree, but of kind. The shift from anticipation to event. The body no longer having the option of preparation because the thing was simply here. Simply the full and total arrival of something that had been building since before she was born. She was standing in the courtyard when it cleared the mountain. The light changed first. A quality of silver in the air, a luminescence that was not the flat white of snow-reflected starlight, but something directed. Something that knew what it was looking for and had found it. The courtyard snow took on a depth it hadn't had before, every crystal suddenly distinct. The whole surface alive with detail that her blood received as information. Precise, total, overwhelming in its completeness. Then the moon itself cleared the ridge. She had seen full moons before. She had looked at them the way everyone looks at full moons. With the ordinary appreciation for a large bright thing in the sky, perhaps a faint aesthetic pleasure. She had never understood that all of that. The poetry, the romance, the mild appreciative glance upward was what the moon looked like when you were not built to receive it properly. This was what the moon looked like when you were. It hit her like a hand pressed flat against her sternum, not painful, not violent, but absolute. A force so total that the question of resisting it did not arise because resistance would have required a self that stood apart from the force, and there was no apart. There was only the force and her inside it, the silver light and her blood answering it with everything it had, every suppressed generation of Voss silver blood waking simultaneously, saying, yes, this, finally, this. She heard Dorian make a sound beside her. Not pain, not distress. The sound of something ending that had needed to end. Relief and release, and the specific quality of attention so long held that its release was almost indistinguishable from grief. Then she heard the shift. She had heard him describe it. She had studied the mechanics. She had told herself she was prepared. She had been wrong in the way everyone is wrong when they believe that description and reality occupy the same space. They do not occupy the same space. Description is a map. Reality is the territory, and the territory does not care what the map said it would be. Dorian shifted. The black wolf that stood in the snow where the prince had stood was not a transformed man. She understood this immediately. In the bone-deep way the blood delivered its truths. This was not Dorian wearing a different body. This was Dorian in his true body. The human form was the translation. This was the original language, enormous and black and alive with an intelligence that was entirely his, entirely present, the gold eyes burning with a recognition that was not animal in the diminished sense that word is usually used, but animal in its original sense, of the living world, completely and without apology. He was the size of a draft horse. His coat was the absolute black of the space between stars. Not dark gray, not near black, but true black, light absorbing, the black of something that had decided what it was, and was entirely that. Steam rose from him in slow columns that caught the moonlight and turned briefly silver before dispersing. His paws left prints in the courtyard snow larger than serving platters, each one sinking deep and clean. He turned to look at her. And the gold of his eyes was the same gold she knew, the same warm, specific intelligence, the same careful attention, the same quality of a person who looks at what they care about with their full focus. She had looked into those eyes for 10 days across library tables and iron room floors, and she knew them, and they knew her, and the knowing was unchanged by the form that carried them. Then the moon touched her. She had been expecting something physical first. The reorganization of muscle and bone. The pain. She had braced for it. It did not begin in the body. It began in the blood. The silver frequency rose past any previous threshold, past the range of anything she had experienced, into something that was no longer a frequency she was feeling, but a frequency she was being. The distinction between signal and receiver collapsed. And she was not hearing the silver. She was the silver. She was not feeling the shift coming. She was the shift. The pain came then, and it was significant, and it lasted exactly as long as it lasted, and not one moment longer, and when it ended completely. The way a bell is simply over when it stops ringing, the air after it cleaner for the resonance left behind. And then she was standing in the snow. And the snow was different, not larger, truer. Every molecule of cold air present and distinct. The snow beneath her paws, 4 of them. The fact of this arriving not as shock but as correction, as the righting of something slightly wrong for 22 years. Alive with the record of everything that had passed over it. She could smell the wolves in the mountains, not as a vague awareness, as individuals, specific, distinct, and each carrying their own complete signature. She turned her head and looked at the courtyard, the gathered bloodlines at the edges. Edric Harkin with those permanent weather eyes, holding an expression she could read clearly. The expression of a man of 73 watching something he has been carrying the hope of for decades become actual. Marin Vane with her hand pressed to her mouth. Tal shaking, the blood in him responding to what he was seeing with the pull she could feel from across the courtyard. Corvin, gold-eyed and still, his 40 years of solitary carrying visible now not as damage but as endurance. The king at the palace door. She looked at him. He looked back at the silver wolf standing in the snow of his courtyard. And in the moonlight of a night he had been dreading and engineering and fearing for 6 years. And something moved through his face that she could read in the new register with perfect clarity. It was not fear. It was not political calculation. It was awe. Plain, unmanaged, the awe of a human being confronting something genuinely larger than their capacity to frame it. And in the confronting, being briefly, involuntarily, humbled into honesty. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she turned to the black wolf beside her. He was watching her with those gold eyes and the full force of his attention. The bond ran between them like a current in a completed circuit. Warm and constant and entirely itself. Not the desperate recognition of the early days, but something that had passed through all of that and come out the other side as something more durable. The settled thing. The thing that lasts. She moved toward him. He was still. That absolute stillness she had watched him practice and maintain in his human form, which in the wolf was not management but nature. The stillness of a creature that had stopped requiring the performance of stillness because stillness was simply what it was at rest. She was 3 feet from him when she felt it happen. The bond completed, not formed. It had been forming for 10 days, for 3 years of dreams. Perhaps for longer than either of them had been alive. Completed, the last connection closing, the circuit sealing. And the chord that rang between them was not 2 notes, not her silver frequency and his, but one thing, one sound made of 2 voices that could not have made it separately. The chord that only existed because both voices were present and both were fully themselves. Not merged, not dissolved. Alongside, fully themselves and therefore capable of this specific resonance, this thing that was larger than either of them alone. She pressed her head against his jaw. He exhaled, the long breath of the iron room, the breath of something that had carried a very heavy thing for a very long time and had just finally completely set it down. He turned his head and breathed her in, and the sound he made was low and resonant, and moved off the palace walls and into the night like a statement of fact. Here. This. Mine and I am hers, and we are here. She raised her head and called to the mountains. The sound that came out of her was silver, the call of the silver blood line that had not been heard in the open air of Valdris territory for 3 generations, rising through the cold night, past the palace walls, past the tree line, past the lower slopes and into the high places where the old wolves ran. The mountains answered. Wave upon wave, the wolves in the high places calling back, their voices different in tone but identical in what they said, which was, received, understood, welcome. Behind her, she heard Tal Vane make a sound that was half laugh and half something with no name. She heard Edric Harkon say very quietly to no one in particular, "There it is." Then the black wolf moved. Not toward the courtyard. Toward the tree line, that long white expanse of unmarked snow between the palace walls and the dark forest, ground with no roads and no human logic about where things should go and how fast. He looked back at her. The invitation was not a word. It was a direction. The entire silver-black, attentive presence of the wolf saying, "Come." She came. They ran. Not away from anything, not toward anything that could be named or located on a map. They ran the way breathing runs, because it was the thing the body was made to do, the fundamental motion, the one that had been waiting in her blood for 22 years behind all the other motions. The snow was nothing. The cold was nothing. The night opened before them like a room she had always lived in, finally lit properly. She was faster than she had known she would be. When the specific surprise of encountering your own capability fully for the first time, finding that the thing you are is larger than your imagination of it had managed to be. Beside her, the black wolf ran. Faster in absolute terms, larger, longer strided, 6 years of full shifting behind him. But he did not run ahead. He ran beside. She felt this as a choice. Felt the ease with which he could have opened the distance, felt the deliberate matching of his pace to hers, the conscious choosing of alongside over ahead. He was choosing alongside. He would, she knew, always choose alongside. The trees opened into a clearing, circular, old, the snow unbroken and blue-white in the moonlight, ringed by trees older than the palace. The clearing had the quality of a room arranged by something older than intention, a place that had settled into itself over centuries and become simply the place where something happens. They stopped. She stood in the center in the moonlight and felt the full measure of what she was. Not the partial accounting, not the suppressed version, the full measure. Silver and Voss and Ashvale and the blood of 12 signatories and one old farmer who had made his peace with giving something up for the sake of a peace he believed in. Who had trusted the blood to find its way to someone who would know what to do with it. She was that someone. She raised her head and called to the mountains a second time. And this call was different from the first. Not the frequency of "I am here, I have arrived." This was longer and lower and fuller, and the call that the blood makes when it is not announcing itself but simply being itself. When the question of identity has been answered and what remains is simply the living of it. I am here, not as news, simply as fact. The most fundamental true thing stated plainly into the cold night air by a silver wolf standing in a moonlit clearing in the oldest forest in Valdris territory, beside a wolf who had been waiting for her in a dream. I am here. The mountains took it and sent it back. The wolves in the high places took it and added their voices. And in the cleared sky above the snow, the full moon burned white and absolute and entirely indifferent and entirely beautiful, doing what it had always done, what it would always do, the faithful and ancient and necessary thing, pulling the tide, calling the wild, and reminding everything that lived beneath it what it was. They ran until the moon had crossed half its arc. Then they returned to the palace. The shift back was gentler, the human form resuming itself with the ease of a garment set aside rather than discarded, neither better nor worse than the wolf, but simply different. Simply the other room in the same house. Ilara stood in the snow in the returning cold with her human hands and her human senses and the silver frequency running steady and constant through her blood, present, permanent, entirely hers, and breathed. Dorian stood beside her. His face was the real face, the one without the management and the practiced blankness of a person making themselves smaller than they were, so the world would not be frightened of their actual size. The face of a man who had stopped fighting himself and found on the other side of the fight that what he was without the fighting was simply good, simply someone worth being. Simply the person who had been there all along beneath the effort of not being him. He looked at her. She looked back. "Well," she said. "Well," he agreed. The sun came up. The snow turned gold. The accord was rewritten. Not the administrative summary, the actual text. The blood protections made explicit and enforceable. The binding clauses revised to reflect voluntary choice rather than mandatory suppression. The Crown committed formally to the dismantling of anti-accord networks within and beyond the territory. And Edric Harkon signed it with the pen of a man who had been waiting his whole life for this moment and had the grace to receive it without theater. Simply sat and signed and put the pen down and looked at the document for a moment and then looked up and nodded once. Marin Vane signed for the southeastern bloodlines. Corvin Voss signed for the western, adding his name to a document in the same hall where his uncle had signed the original, the Voss lineage present at both ends of the story, the arc of the blood complete. On the 8th day after the moon, the king called Ilara to his private study. The betrothal, he said, at his window as always, organizing the inward before turning it outward. As I announced it in the throne room, it was made without your consent under conditions that did not permit refusal. He turned. I am releasing it. She waited. That is not a statement about what should happen between you and my son, he said, with the precision of a man who has thought carefully about the difference between what he wants and what he has the right to want. What should happen between you and my son is your decision and his, made between the two of you, without the crown's architecture around it. He paused. The architecture is removed. What you build in its place, or do not build, is yours. Thank you, she said. Do not thank me for returning what I should not have taken. A pause. You are your grandfather's blood, as he had said in the throne room, but it meant something entirely different now. She found Dorian in the corridor outside the iron room. The door was open. He was standing in the doorway looking in, at the circular stone room. In the iron brackets on the walls, the worn path in the floor that recorded years of a wolf's necessary containment. She came up beside him and looked with him. I made a promise, she said. I remember. Do you have tools? He looked at her and almost smiled. And then did smile, fully, the real one, the face under the face that she had filed on the first night and had never stopped finding startling and good. I know where the maintenance staff keeps their equipment, he said. Then let's start. They spent the afternoon removing the iron brackets from the walls. The work was loud and effortful, and occasionally the brackets resisted with the stubbornness of things that have been in place for 30 years and have strong opinions about remaining. Once Dorian hit his thumb with a hammer and said something in the old wolf language that she was reasonably certain was profane. She laughed, genuinely, fully, the laugh of a person who has arrived somewhere good through a route that was difficult and has found the arrival worth every step of the route. He looked at her laughing, and the expression on his face was something she did not have a word for yet. She would find one. There was time. when the last bracket came out of the wall. They stood in the circular room and looked at the spaces where they had been, the raw holes in the stone, the old iron marks around them where decades of pressure had stained the walls. The room was still the room. The floor still bore the worn path. The history of what it had held was still in the stone, in the particular quality of air, and in the specific silence of a space that had witnessed years of difficult nights and absorbed them without comment, with the geological patience of matter that exists on a different timescale than the events that pass through it. But the brackets were gone. "It will need other things," Dorian said, looking at the room. "Rugs, a fire, windows eventually, if the structure allows." He paused. "It should be something else. I don't know yet what." "We'll figure it out," she said. "That is what later is for." He looked at her. The gold in his eyes, the settled warmth of him. The man and the wolf both present and both at ease, occupying their full and actual space, no longer requiring the managed compression that had been the cost of being what he was in a world that had not known what to do with it. Why? And she thought of her grandfather's name in the registry, Silverblood, full binding, voluntary, a man who had given up the wolf for peace. She thought about whether the peace had been worth what he gave, and whether the giving had been his to do, and whether the blood that had been waiting 22 years in her was the answer to a question Emmerich Voss had not been able to finish asking. She was beginning to believe it was. Outside the corridor window, the snow was falling again, softer than it had fallen at the beginning of this story, more patient. The snow of midwinter rather than the snow of a warning, not a burial shroud, not a harbinger, simply winter doing what winter does, covering the world in white and leaving it to decide what it would look like when spring arrived. The wolves in the mountains were quiet today. Not absent. She felt them, would always feel them now. Those distant, warm presences in the high, cold places, indifferent to the politics of blood and accords and kings, interested only in the moon and the snow and the running. She found that she was not sorry to be what she was. She found, more precisely, that she was glad, not in the performed way of someone making the best of circumstances, but in the genuine way of a person who has arrived at the truth of themselves and found the truth livable. Found it more than livable, found it, after the difficulty of the arriving, to be exactly where they were always going. Emmerich Voss had stood in a room and signed his name and suppressed his blood for a peace he believed in, and the peace had been imperfect, and the covenant had been broken, and the blood had kept going anyway. And here at the other end of it was his granddaughter with iron brackets in her hands and a wolf beside her and an accord being rewritten below and the whole long frozen thing beginning at last to move. It was enough. It was exactly enough. Dorian took the brackets from her hands and stacked them against the wall, and the iron rang against the stone with a sound that echoed through the circular room and down the old corridor and into the bones of the palace. And when it faded, the silence that replaced it was different from the silence that had been there before. Lighter, as silences are when the things that weighted them have been removed. "Come on," he said. "Where?" "Outside." He looked at the window, the snow falling soft against the glass. "I want to run." She looked at him, the gold in his eyes, the settled warmth of him, and the man and the wolf both present and both finally, completely at home. The silver in her blood rose to meet the invitation the way it rose to meet the moon. Naturally, completely, with the ease of something moving in the direction it was always meant to move. "Yes," she said. They went out into the snow. The palace fell away behind them. The tree line opened before them. The cold was the world, and the world was large and white and full of depth and the smell of everything that lived in it and the sound of everything that moved through it. And the two wolves ran, the silver and the black, side by side through unmarked snow, through the quiet forest, through the long, late winter afternoon, already carrying at its edges the first faint suggestion of the season that comes after. The season of thaw, of opening. One of the world deciding once again that it will continue, that the long cold dark was not the end, but simply the condition that preceded the next and necessary beginning. They ran until the palace was out of sight and the mountains were close and the sky was deep blue above the dark tree line. And then Alara raised her head and called to the mountains, and the mountains called back, and the wolves in the high places called with them, and the sound filled the winter air and rose, and did not stop. The snow covered the tracks they had left. It always does. But they had been there, and the ground beneath the snow remembered. The silver wolf has found her voice. The bond is complete. The accord has been rewritten. And somewhere in the outer territories, the organization behind Gregor Fenn is reading a letter that tells them their plan has failed, and that a silver wolf now stands bonded to the crown of Valdris. They have been patient for 30 years. They will not stay quiet. The story of Silverbound is not over. It has only just found its teeth. If this story moved you, if you felt something in these words, hit subscribe right now because the next chapter of this world is coming and you do not want to miss where the blood goes next. Drop a comment below and tell me one thing. Are you Team Alara, or did this story make you understand the king just a little? I read every single one, and I will see you at the next full mo.